So, Tony, one of the aspects that may have helped to make the virtual water concept have more impact in a general sense is this water footprinting measurement. How did you come to be involved with that? Was that something you sort of led, or was it something someone else led?
No, it was a conscious decision by Aaron Hoekstra, who was a professor in Delft at the time. He's now in Enschede, but still a leading figure in water metrics, an engineer, a modeler, who had shown signs because his PhD had quite a lot of soft science in it as well as the hydrology. He spotted the virtual water idea, and by chance green water, blue water was coined about the same time in the late 80s, and footprinting was also getting going through the late 80s and then through the 90s. And so it was quite natural that someone that had the skills to do water footprinting as opposed to other sorts of environmental footprinting should pick it up. And he had to, there was a centre there doing modelling, and he was a recognised modeller. I'm astonished that modelers have the courage to make the assumptions they do, and then in this case there's such an appetite. This was my main experience. There's such an appetite amongst chief executives of corporations and politicians and scientists for metrics. I mean, some of them believe that if you can't make it, you can't put metrics on a problem or issue, it's not an issue. I mean, if you can't have the numbers. I mean, McNamara at the World Bank for 10 years as a president in the 60s. He had this reputation, and I saw him do it once at a water meeting, saying, "Give me the numbers, give me the numbers." And of course, the poor people, they are honest scientists, and of course they can, and as soon as they show hesitation in finding numbers, then they're destroyed, because if they can't have solid numbers which they can speak fluent prose about, where they're destructible people. But I noticed that because there were numbers, and Aaron is a very professional. If you look at the water site for water footprinting, it's a very, very wonderful thing. All the stuff that he's done in the 17 years since then, it's a triumph of information and responsible modelling. But I found that I was at one or two meetings with him over the next sort of 5-7 years, and we often got into this position, especially in Spain at a couple of meetings. Spain's an interesting place because Spain has got big water problems like California, and it's got an awful lot of hydraulic engineers and a long tradition of building dams and solving things with concrete and so on. And then in that same period, so 2002 through to 2007, there's a very good group in Madrid of economists and engineers, hydrogeologists, gave a lot of thought to it. And Spain has decent data, and so they came up with much more interesting data than Aaron did, because the amazing thing is that Aaron's work was done not with a big set of postdocs and big rich funding. It was done by a couple of PhD students and 3 or 4 master's students. He had an amazing capacity to get results out of this set of inputs. So, and I remember I also at a meeting in Frankfurt at one point, and we were being pressed about the political side. And I remember him saying very clearly in the Frankfurt meeting that no, the numbers were not necessarily relevant to policy. But then he was overtaken, in my view. You can see I respect him highly, I'm not being critical. But he was overtaken by the private sector, because the public sector wanted to have some feel of this, and the UK government definitely did put something into it, but the vast majority of the interest came from the corporate sector. So the big battalions like Unilever, where they said, "Well, what we need is life cycle analysis." So they got a few life cycles people from, I think, URS, the corporate, the consulting company, and they looked at all their products and did life cycle analysis with respect to water in all of them. And I discovered recently that they do it every 2 years, because I knew, I did ask them in the late sort of 2009-10 period, you know, how often you do this? You know, we've done it once, it's so expensive we can't, but they must have been persuaded to do it every couple of years. So, but they did it in a defensive mode, because they didn't want to have numbers that could damage them were very important. So it was the risk of reputation, which was important. So, but they then have done so much work that, compared with, you know, the wonderful master students and wonderful research students in Enschede and Delft mainly, you know, then he's kept that going with that sort of research. This must have cost 100,000 times more than his if you took it together, but it all resides inside Coca-Cola, inside Pepsi, or inside Unilever. So I've, over the recent years, realized that the private sector is pulled way ahead, but they don't share. But as I've said earlier in these conversations, they only handle 1% of the water. Mm-hmm. But it's as if, you know, they're really big water managers. They very quickly realized when they started to look at their water footprints in their business that the vast majority was outside the fence of their, you know, it was down there on the farms. And they recognized that. And they've been doing certain things about it by investing in farming to some extent. But the amount of money being spent is very small. Mm-hmm. And at least one company, the money doesn't come from the operational budget, it comes from the philanthropic budget. In other words, it's, you know, they need it to be done, they need it to be seen to be done, but they don't want the cost of it to be reflected in their operations. There are absolutely extraordinary people in the corporate sector, such as Paul Polman of Unilever. You should talk to him on one of these, because he speaks much better than I do, and with all the authority of surviving in the hard world of the corporate world. But he speaks so well about stewardship. Yeah.
So do you see these as kind of, you know, spin-off intellectual developments that sort of drew on your idea, or have they helped to give your idea in its wider application more credibility, do you think, in policy circles or political circles?
Yes, since they took it seriously, but then, you know, I'm completely aware that the surge in interest was because people in universities and people in the accounting world and people in the corporate world and the people in the government world, if you can't put numbers to things, so Aaron's contribution is absolutely essential. What I then discovered, there was a tension between not the purity of the virtual water idea, but the sort of simplicity of it and the disproportionate explanation that came from that, compared with the mistakes that get made when you try to put metrics on it. Because the big and important thing to remember is that impact is more important than volume. So that you can have a high volume of water going into a commodity which then goes across the world, but it doesn't really matter. There may be environmental impact costs which should be taken into account. So it is in fact impact that counts, whether that incorporation of the input and the damage done in using it causes an expense which should be reflected in the price. And therefore, if it was, that would be one way of getting the customer to realize, or in some sort of labeling way, which hasn't proved to be a very successful way of doing it. Partly because impact is harder to labelize than volume.
So the numbers are more kind of relative to context than they appear then on the kind of surface.
Yeah.
Okay.